So during the 60-year period that the French ruled over Cambodia, there wasn't really a great amount of economic development or modernisation. A limited number of roads were built by the French, mainly connecting major cities to one another, and some industries did grow. For example, rubber plantations opened up across the country, and things like corn was prioritised as a crop to be exported overseas, and so was rice. But the reason these things were a focus of the French is because they could export these things to other countries for a profit. So the main focus of these industries was just to get profit for the French, not to modernise the country or to build it at all. There was very little effort, in fact, towards educating the people, building great infrastructure projects, or developing the country in any way. And one of the main reasons for this is Cambodia was actually really overlooked when it came to the Indochina colony. It was one of the least profitable parts for the French, so they didn't have the same level of oversight or intrusion that they did into places like Vietnam. It was kind of just forgotten about. Another development as well that came out of the French rule was the introduction of Catholicism. There are a couple of cathedrals that were built in Cambodia at this time, but it really should be noted that French religion didn't really make great way in Cambodia. The vast majority of the population still practiced the same religion which they had previously, which was Buddhism, and there weren't many Cambodians converting to Catholicism. So I talked a little bit before about the myth that there was no opposition to French rule, but it does have to be admitted that there was a lot less opposition to the French in Cambodia than there was in Vietnam. So what are some of the reasons that Cambodia was pretty passive when it came to French rule? Well, the first one I've already identified. They were in a bit of a sticky situation already, having powerful neighbours who had their eyes on Cambodian land and property. I think the second factor that's probably quite important for the low level of opposition is that France didn't greatly change the existing power structure. They didn't get rid of the royal family or kill the Cambodian king. They allowed him to maintain his throne, and therefore the idea or the image that Cambodia still had its royal family and was still under royal rule. Another factor for the acceptance of French colonization was also the lack of education for most of the population. So the vast majority of the population of Cambodia under France had really low literacy rates. And the French were really reluctant to improve literacy rates because they didn't want Cambodians to discover alternative political systems. Keep in mind that this is the time of history where ideas like nationalism and self-determination are sweeping the world, and they were spreading really quickly through Asia, particularly India and Southeast Asia. And most of the population's inability to read means that they couldn't read political texts and be exposed to these ideas. So they weren't really fully aware of alternative methods, and especially alternative ideas like nationalism. That being said, there was a kind of national consciousness emerging at this time, an idea of what it meant to be Cambodian and referring to the previous history of Cambodia when Cambodia was powerful, but it was mainly among educated Cambodians and Khmer people. So we've looked at French Indochina and its impacts on Cambodia. Let's now look at the colonization of Vietnam. And just as a reminder of what happened immediately before colonization, in 1802, after a period of civil wars, infighting, and the establishment of separate areas of Vietnam, Vietnam was officially reunified by the Nguyen dynasty, and they had their capital in a city called Hue. Before colonization by the French, Vietnam was ruled by this dynasty, and the government under this dynasty was really hierarchical and tightly organized. Everyone involved in the government were called scholar administrators, so they were people with a great deal of education who oversaw the running of the country. When it came to foreign relations, the new Vietnam united and reunified again was recognized by the Chinese emperor of the time. However, Vietnam did have to pay what were called tributes to China. Tributes are basically gifts which are given on a recurring basis to a superior or more powerful nation or empire. So what that meant was every couple of years, Vietnam had to send tribute to China, and sometimes the tribute could be a massive drain on the economy. For example, one year they had to send 600 pieces of silk, 200 pieces of cotton, 12,000 ounces of perfume, in addition to jade and seashells. At the same time as they were tributes of China, Vietnam was also trying to make itself more powerful in the region. And the way that they did so was they tried to enforce a tributary relationship on Cambodia and Laos, where Cambodia and Laos had to send Vietnam tributes or gifts. So basically, they were trying to establish a pretty clear pecking order. Yes, they had to pay tribute to China, but these smaller and weaker nations had to pay tribute to them. In 1834, they attempted to go all out and actually make Cambodia a province of Vietnam. This was obviously pretty bitterly resisted by Cambodia. It led to a massive revolt, but it was also resisted by the Siamese. And Thailand actually intervened to stop Vietnam fully taking over Cambodia. They didn't do it as a measure of goodwill though. What Siam decided to do was to carve Cambodia up between Siam and Vietnam. They both took key territories of Cambodia in 1847 and established a protectorate over these areas. So how do the French come into this? How do you go from having quite a powerful dynasty in 1802 to later becoming a colony of France within the same century? Well, French influence in the region had been growing steadily for the last couple of centuries, and it's in the 1800s, the early and mid 1800s, that French aspirations really grow and unhinge the Nguyen dynasty. French traders and diplomats and missionaries kept coming to Vietnam as they had in the previous century, but in ever-increasing waves and in greater numbers. And it was the missionaries, the religious figures who were trying to convert people to Catholicism, that were actually the most problematic and dangerous aspect for the royal family and the emperor. You can see the emperor of the time, Emperor Minh Mang, had quite a low opinion of the French by this quote at the side. He states that there's always been a strategy for halting the advances of barbarians, by which he means foreigners, particularly the French. Our own court deals with the Westerners according to the following principles. If they come here, we do not oppose them. If they leave, we do not chase them. We simply treat them as barbarians. If their vessels came to trade, we only permit them to anchor at one place, which is Tra Son. When exchanges are finished, they must depart. We do not allow them to remain ashore for long, and we do not allow the people to trade directly with them. Thus, even if they are cunning and deceitful, there will be no openings through which they can take advantage in order to cause troubles. So you can see in the 1820s that the French are already a pretty destabilizing force, and that the royal family has quite a low opinion of them, calling them barbarians and being reluctant to allow them to have much influence in the countryside. Even so, some members of the royal family and the court recognized that it was dangerous for the emperor to continue to hold on to traditions, to not westernize and to not modernize. And the main concern of a lot of these people was that Vietnam had not effectively modernized its defense systems. They saw the threat that French ships and the French Navy posed, and they recognized and encouraged the emperor to modernize and build the Vietnamese Navy and military. Unsuccessfully, however. After 1832, the Nguyen government began a really serious effort to rid Vietnam of French missionaries. They were pretty fed up with the spread and growth of Catholicism within France, and they looked at trying to stop it through any means possible. They released a series of laws which actually forbid the practice of Christianity at all. This meant that people in Vietnam who had already converted to Christianity they had to worship in secret, and it forced Christian communities to go underground. However, even this still wasn't enough. The Nguyens really wanted to eliminate the religion in the country, and it is estimated that in the next 25 years, 95% of priests in Vietnam were executed, which is a pretty clear statement on their position when it comes to Catholicism. So, what was the response to this crackdown on Catholicism and the bloody methods used to expel missionaries from Vietnam? Well, French missionaries started off by appealing to the French government for help. They asked them to intervene militarily in Vietnam, so come in with their armies and navies, and establish a French protectorate over Vietnam. They said that their converts in Vietnam were at great risk of their life, and that the French government owed it to them to protect French citizens there. This actually suited the purposes of the French government pretty well. As I'd said before, they were pretty interested in the region, in the economic possibilities, and this gave them the perfect excuse to move into the area. A series of skirmishes took place between the French Navy and the Vietnamese Navy. Several Vietnamese gunships were destroyed, and 10,000 Vietnamese naval officers lost their lives. And over the next few years, Nguyens attempted to hold on to their power. They tried to resist European infiltration and isolate their country, but they just couldn't succeed against the superior forces of the French. And the French steadily began seizing power in different regions and taking over the country. This process started in 1858, and it was finalised and realised in 1887 when France officially proclaimed French Indochina and founded the colony. When the French were defending their invasion and colonisation of the region, the French also referred to other reasons besides defending the missionaries. They developed their own principle called the mission civilisatrice, or basically the civilizing mission. This is basically a French form of what the English people had called the white man's burden. The idea behind it was that superior European cultures, such as the French and the English, actually had a duty to go into other parts of the world and to educate them in the correct way, to show them the correct religion, which was according to the French Catholicism, to teach them the European languages, and to make them civilized. They claimed that it was also their responsibility to develop regions of Africa and Asia, to introduce modern political ideas like democracy, to socially reform them, and to make them join the modern world. They said that without European intervention, these places would remain backward and uncivilized and impoverished. Obviously, the civilizing mission was just an excuse. It was a facade. The real motive for the French colonizing that area was obviously for profit and economic exploitation, a demand for resources, raw materials, and cheap labor. However, they couldn't explicitly say that they had only done this to benefit French interests, so this was the excuse. It should also be noted that in general, French colonization of this area was a lot more brutal than British colonization of places like India and Burma. It was more haphazard, it was more uneven,